have you ever felt excluded from LGBT spaces due to misconceptions about your identity?
Um, Apart from the aforementioned biphobia, not so much, but that's mostly because I never really made that much of an effort to be a part of queer spaces. Um, Mostly because, and again, I don't want to sound like a pick-me or whatever, but while I do like hanging around people and in communities that are generally quite queer, going specifically to queer communities always felt a little bit odd to me, you know? Like, so I have nothing in common with these people except for the fact that I'm not heterosexual or cisgender, right? It's not really like a it's not the lead-in that I'm really looking for. Now, there's a big difference between like a queer space and a kind of like queer area that caters to something else entirely. So, for example, there were hiking groups back at my university that had big gay energy. But they weren't about like showing up and being gay or whatever. That was just happened to be a thing that they were. I don't know if I'd want to go to a queer party, but I would go to a party that was queer. But because of my aversion to sort of deliberate and specific queer communities, I never really had an opportunity to be excluded much. In the rare times that I would go, I'm loud and boisterous. So what are they going to do? Kick me out, right? I mean, I can always talk my way through that.
I've noticed that at least some people, when seeking out these spaces, there can be like lingering internalized homophobia with some people or transphobia that pushes some people out. But it's good that you haven't really experienced that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I know that there are plenty of queer spaces that are still pretty exclusionary to trans people, for example, or to non-binary people. I know, for example, that like there's a lot of biphobia in the LGBT community because there's a resentment towards them for their ability to straight pass, essentially. That people who are exclusively homosexual, anytime they're acting out a romantic or a sexual drive, they have to do so in a way which socially alienates them. Whereas with bisexual people, the term they use is that we always have the option to be with a opposite gender partner or whatever. But that's not really how it works, right? It's not like bi people are like, I'd like to face less stigma today. I will be with this person. I don't think it normally goes that way. I guess it can for some, but I think for the most part, you just find who you like and you're in for whatever storm that brews.
Yeah, and there can be biases towards one gender or the other, but I don't, it shouldn't really matter to whether they're included into the LGBT spaces. Like it's always really weird when I see people like that.
Yeah. Well, it is indeed pretty cringe, but I think that on the whole, the lefts and queer communities are more inclusive than they've ever been, so we should be happy about that at least.
Do you think non-monogamy and polyamory should fall under the LGBTQ umbrella?
Probably not. You can make an. I don't even know if I'd want to have the term queerness apply. It's definitely something, but to me, non-monogamy would be more in like the. I think it's closer aligned to like the kink space than anything. There are people who have argued that being like into leather should be part of the queer community, and I've argued against that too. Pretty substantively. I don't think there's a strong cultural overlap there, or there's not much of an experiential overlap necessarily. Being into leather doesn't necessarily mean that you have any more of a cultural alignment with the broader queer community than not being into leather, I think. So if I have to make that argument with leather, I guess I'd make it about non-monogamy as well. I think you can advocate for issues related to non-monogamy and the acceptance of non-monogamy without invoking queer language, though.
Okay, that makes sense. I generally think that it can be simply because it is sort of like a subculture within communities.
Can I respond
kind of
really
like
quick to
kink.
someone in chat?
Yeah, sure.
Somebody says, Vaush is just wrong here. The leather community and LGBT community have supported each other for decades. Yeah, but ask your average gay person if a cis-het person who wears leather should be considered queer. They're probably going to say no. I'm not saying there isn't a parallel or an overlap there, or that there's, like, no cultural overlap. I'm just saying I don't think that overlap exists to the extent that people would be considered queer simply because they are, they wear leather or whatever.
Yeah, and tying queerness to kink was also, a component of homophobia.
Yeah, I don't really like how there are some queer people who insist on that. There are a lot of like super left anarchist types on Twitter who are like, yes, actually, me being gay should be socially destructive, which I think is a really privileged and like head up ass position, you know? Like queerness isn't
Hmm.
just you in your 20s on Twitter masturbating while chatting with your mutuals. Queerness encompasses like hundreds of millions of people. Is it really like is it socially is it a social improvement for both the movement and for you know, especially a lot of younger people or people in like more reactionary communities, for the queer movement as a whole to go like, yes, being gay and kink, these are one and the same. The whole argument was that like it should be treated the same as heterosexuality for decades, but some people are like, well, no, actually, we do want to be permanently like the pariah, the social outcast, the rejection of normality, in which case you don't actually want equality. So, in a way, I'd consider that almost a reactionary tendency. You know, you can't like the end state of gay and trans acceptance is you being as normal and boring as cishet people. I'm sorry, but that's how acceptance works. So if you
Well, I
hate
think
that so much that uh, you're gonna be like, oh well, we should deliberately ostracize ourselves. Well, okay, well you're not really fighting for acceptance then. You're fighting for, I don't know, being cool.
I think sometimes it falls more into the semantical game of like of assimilation versus acceptance, where people will be like, "Well, we don't want to assimilate and basically shape our culture to the normal culture, and instead have the normal culture come over to us."
Yeah, but you can do that without inextricably tying queerness to certain cultural elements that are considered like less appropriate, right? Like, for example,
Hmm.
heterosexual culture entails a lot of thing in my head, like in my mind, you know. But I wouldn't like go around saying that the two are inextricably linked, or I would make the argument that we should treat all heterosexual people like they're part of the same uh, block. It's not really
Yeah.
about assimilation. It's just that as a product of social malignment, there are certain types of behaviors that are acceptable when you're the outsider, but impossible when you're not when you're the insider. And one of those, I think, is the idea that like being queer should be in some way heavily defined through your sexual like predilections. That's something that's been used to stigmatize the queer community for a long time, and I just feel really bad, you know? Like, imagine if there were big queer leaders going out there being like, actually, yes, being gay is about destroying society. Yes, that's right. We are all corrupting your children to worship Satan, blah, blah, blah. And imagine, like, a mom hearing that and then turning to her 14-year-old son who just yesterday said, like, yeah, I think I might be into men. Like, how do you think you're making that kid's life better? It past a certain point, it's not about improving things for people, and it just becomes about like in-group identity and a desire to distinguish yourself from the normies. But you can do both of those things without assimilating. You just have to draw a distinction between the baseline, this is what being gay is, and the higher tier, oh, and also I want to destroy society with my gayness. If you can just distinguish those two things, then I don't think there's any issue there, right? You can be like, yeah, you know, being gay is just a sexuality. There's nothing about it that's inherently, you know, deviant or whatever. We're all just trying to live our lives. And then turn around and go, but my particular flavor of being gay does involve being gangbanged by 13 werewolves in the middle of a park. That's fine. That's based even. Go for it.
What are your thoughts on corporate support for the LGBT community, and how we can push corporations to sort of do better in terms of like representation and like in supporting the LGBT community?
Um, well, I mean, the rainbow capitalist shit's generally a good side, or it's a good sign of things for our side, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think that corporations running out there with queer pride flags necessarily makes life better for queer people, but it's kind of a passive indication of the way the wind is blowing. Corps will do whatever makes them the most money. If they think that like placating to us culturally is going to make them more money, they'll do that. The fact that they overwhelmingly do that, same with Black Lives Matter and other shit like that, is kind of an indication things are doing well for us, you know? If it was the other side of things, where like corporations were all posting like Blue Lives Matter sympathy flags or whatever, you know, obviously we'd be upset about that. So it seems to me fair that we should be happy when they don't do that and instead do the opposite of that.
Just a good indication of where we're at culturally, but ultimately a lot of it's like empty gestures and it doesn't really affect people.
Yeah, well, we should be cynical about it, of course, because the big risk here is that people think that what the corps are doing is enough. You know, the real threat is always going to be passivity and acceptance, or sorry, not acceptance. A better term would be what does it mean when you've achieved a certain level of something, but then you're done? Like you think, oh, that's enough. What is that term? Complacency. Thank you, chat. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm hardcore blanking today. I haven't eaten enough food. Complacency is the real threat. So we should simultaneously say, oh, it's good that these corporations are doing X or Y, and we should make fun of them for not doing more. In terms of what more they could do, well, social supports, well, I guess a good way to put it is like, look at Netflix, right? Netflix spent millions of dollars on Dave Chappelle's like Turf special, but they're also outwardly, at least in optics, a progressive community. The best thing that they could really do is commit to the messaging that aligns with their their branding. One of the best ways that I've seen this done in recent past is like modern cartoons are really fucking gay. Like on Cartoon Network, I don't know if you've like watched Steven Universe or Star vs. the Force of Evil or any of that other crap, but like I feel like modern cartoons are really, really gay. In a good, I mean, yeah, like I'm saying a good way. They're much,
Steven Universe was great, by the way.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it tripped at a few hurdles, but like altogether, I think that it's indicative of positive social forces. The Owl House is currently running. That's gay. There's always gay stuff. The Owl House is like a non-binary character, and this is, I mean, it's all happening so fast, you know? It wasn't that long ago, 5 years ago, who knew what non-binary meant? Things are moving really, really quickly, and that's great. So
yeah, I didn't even know what non-binary meant like 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, it's I mean, it feels pretty goddamn new. Of course, obviously, historically, it's a bajillion years old, but we know that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like how long has it been culturally relevant, and the answer, at least here in America, is very little time. So the more we commit to stuff like that, I think the more easily the more easily we'll be able to have these conversations in the future, because we've all grown up with a kind of shared default acceptance for, queer culture.
What does pride mean to you, and what does it represent?
God, I think, to me, so pride means a couple of things. First of all, I think it's vestigial. Pride only needs to exist because there's social opposition to fight against, you know? Like, in a non-homophobic world, or non-cis standard, in a world which was perfectly unbigoted, there would be no need for pride, because there would be no cultural defiance of stereotype or of hatred or of superstition. It would just be another sort of normal thing that you could be. But obviously we don't live in that world. So I think right now it's a nice show of solidarity. I think that it's very uplifting. And I think it operates as a kind of cultural nexus for a lot of people. Not even just gay people, but people in general, where it informs the way in which we navigate a really difficult and confusing, incomplete set of gender stereotypes. So I think pride is good for those things. I think it's like a beacon in the dark, basically.